Hi, I'm Whitney Espick, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Welcome to the MIT Forum for Equity. My name is Corbin Swain. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the MIT Department of Biological Engineering, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. So today's broadcast is sponsored in part by MIT Federal Credit Union, MIT Professional Education, and MIT Sloan Executive Education, and the Mind, Hand, Heart Community Innovation Fund. We welcome your questions during this discussion. And just as a reminder that in this series, we aim to create an open and honest dialogue that is respectful of the many places from which we approach challenges and the realities of the world we're in. So please bear these in mind, that these conversations are sometimes difficult, and we all benefit from active listening and respectful communication, especially via the chat and Q&A. So for those joining us on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature found on your toolbar. We'll try our best to get to as many questions as we can. And we'll open the general chat after the presentation for discussion and networking. So today's topic is the case for reparations. Professor William Darty, a PhD alum from 1978, is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. Darty is the author of From Here to Equity, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, published April of 2020 by UNC Press. You can find a link to the book and his full bio on the event page, and we'll post it in the chat now as well. So welcome, Professor Darty.
Thank you. Thanks so much for, it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to participate on an MIT alumni event. Our book, From Here to Equality, was first published this year in April, as you mentioned. It represents approximately a decade of research and work that we've done, Kirsten Mullen and myself. And it's our endeavor to try to make a systematic case for reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery. And in large part, we think that there's some innovative themes that we take up in the book that are generally not treated in other studies of reparations. One of those is the plan that we outline at in the final chapter of the book for how you might actually execute a reparations project. But another is a set of issues that I want to take up after the initial phase of the conversation with you, which is the question of compensated emancipation. And I'll try to talk about that in some greater detail in a moment. But I'd like to start by making a strong assertion. Okay, so they tell me that you should be gentle with your audience when you're talking about a heavily controversial topic. But I'm going to actually be forceful at the very beginning, and I'm going to make the assertion that the Black-white wealth gap in the United States is the critical economic indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy. So that's my opening remark, and I'm going to try to build the case from reparations that's predicated on that opening remark. One of the things that I think it's important to recognize is that the magnitude of the difference in wealth between Blacks and whites is largely underestimated. Excuse me. Is largely underestimated, both in the context of academic research as well as in the public forum. It's dramatically underestimated. And there's also a tendency to associate wealth exclusively with home ownership. But what's important to recognize is at the upper end of the wealth distribution, particularly among those households that are in the upper 25% of the wealth distribution, home ownership is not as significant a component of their assets. What really is significant for the upper 25% is either business ownership, property and real estate, or financial assets. And so I'd like to begin the conversation by giving you all a sense of the magnitude of the disparities that are associated with business ownership between blacks and whites. Recently, I believe Reed Hastings, the owner of Netflix, provided a $100 million grant to black banks. This constitutes approximately 2% of Netflix's cash holdings. I view this as a generous gift, but unfortunately, the breach in the scale and impact of the top black-owned banks and the top white-owned banks is enormous. It's cavernous. Okay. So the top 5 black banks in the United States have approximately $2 billion in assets. JP Morgan Chase alone has $2.7 trillion in assets, nearly $3 trillion. The 100th bank on America's listing of top banks in the United States, the 100th white-owned bank, has upwards of 20 times as many assets as the top 5 black-owned banks. And the 250th bank on the list, Preferred Bank, has $4.7 billion in assets, more than twice the assets of the top 5 owned black-owned banks. So $100 million clearly could be meaningful for these top 5 banks in terms of maintaining their sustainability and maintaining their effectiveness. After all, $100 million constitutes about 5% of their total assets. However, it only is 1/20,000th of JP Morgan Chase's total assets. Now, Chase themselves have just made a commitment of $30 billion that would go in some way to the black-owned or black-controlled credit system. This $30 billion would be again significant from the standpoint of the black-owned banks themselves, but not very significant in terms of addressing the question of the magnitude of the differential in business ownership between blacks and whites. In fact, it would be approximately 1% of JP Morgan Chase's assets. Okay, so Mehrsa Baradaran has made the comment that the combined assets of all black-owned banks amount to a bad weekend for JP Morgan Chase revenue-wise. Okay. So black-owned banks are relatively small and fragile in comparison with white-owned banks. Black-owned businesses generally are relatively small and fragile. Prior to the coronavirus crisis, it was estimated that black-owned businesses taken collectively have a retail sales that's approximately 1/2 or less of Walmart's total annual retail sales. In the aftermath of the coronavirus, Robert Fairley, economist, has estimated that 41% of black-owned businesses have gone out of operation. These differentials in terms of business ownership are only a fragment of the full array of differences in asset holdings between blacks and whites that explain the magnitude of the racial wealth differential overall. How large is that differential? Well, black Americans who are descendants of US slavery are approximately 13% of the nation's population, but possess only about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. This translates into a corresponding condition based upon the Survey of Consumer Finances for 2016 that indicates that on average, the Black household's net worth is about $800,000 less than the white household's net worth. Now, that's an estimate that I'm giving at the mean. And frequently people complain about looking at the mean differential because it's inclusive of outlying households, outlying families. But in this context, I think it's vital to use the mean instead of the median. Now, the median gap is about $153,000 and appears to be something that might be more manageable in terms of eliminating the differential. But the mean gap of $800,000 should be the object of our attention for the following reason. If we want to bring the Black share of wealth into proportion with the Black share of the nation's population, then we need to raise the Black share from 2.5% to at least 13%. And this would require targeting the mean rather than the median. Moreover, 97% of white wealth is held by households above the white median. This is not entirely a consequence of the fact that there's a handful of extraordinarily wealthy white billionaires, although that is the case. But we also should keep in mind the fact that 25% of white households have a net worth in excess of $1 million, while it's only 4% of Black households. Okay. So the argument that we make in the pages of From Here to Equality is that a primary or central objective of a reparations plan must be elimination of the racial wealth gap. This would require an expenditure of at least $10 to $12 trillion, and it's an expenditure that should be borne by the federal government. We also argue in the pages of From Here to Equality that the federal government is the culpable party that has to be held accountable for the host of atrocities that have been inflicted upon African Americans, at least from the formation of the Republic in 1776. Some folks say you really need to date the formation of the Republic to 1789 with the adoption of the US Constitution. I'm okay either way. The range of atrocities are simply devastating regardless of which year you use as a starting point, and the case for reparations is just as strong. I want to emphasize at the outset that our case for reparations is not predicated exclusively on slavery. It is actually predicated on 3 phases of American history, including the present phase. First, of course, are the atrocities that are associated with slavery. But the second phase is the period of nearly a century of legal segregation in the United States, what we customarily refer to as the Jim Crow period. And since the forming of the foundation of the Republic, of the United States as a republic, actually the Jim Crow years exceed the years of slavery. Okay, the Jim Crow years exceed the years of slavery. And then the final phase for consideration is the period after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, where we are still confronted with mass incarceration. We are confronted with police executions of unarmed Blacks. We're confronted with sustained discrimination in credit, employment, and housing markets. So in an ugly way, the beat goes on. And the point of From Here to Equality is to make the case for stopping the beat from continuing. And the way in which we can stop the beat from continuing and engage in an act of restitution is by addressing the immense racial wealth gap. And so I'll be glad to return to a conversation about policy alternatives, et cetera. But the conclusion that we've drawn is that the way in which you would close the racial wealth gap successfully and effectively is by having a social policy that would be directed at eliminating the differential in average household wealth between blacks and whites in the United States. And this would require a reparations project that would be specific to Black American descendants of US slavery. Okay. So that's the first phase of what I would like to discuss today. The second phase involves an argument that we frequently hear about why the debt has already been paid. This is an argument that, you know, we surprisingly find cropping up time and time again. But a number of pundits have consistently argued that the debt has already been paid because of the loss of 700,000 lives in the course of the Civil War. So there's a number of responses that I'd like to make to that perspective. The first is that close to half of those lives were lost by individuals who were fighting to preserve slavery in the United States. The second is, if we examine the Union deaths alone, there was a significant mortality that was incurred by Black soldiers who fought on behalf of the Union Army for the purposes of achieving their own liberation. So it is very, very difficult to think about emancipation as a gift that was handed to Black Americans without their involvement and direct engagement in the process of their liberation. Third point that I would like to make is that there's an important distinction that's been made in a quotation from Malcolm X between pulling the knife out and healing the wound after a stabbing has taken place. The ending of slavery was a matter of pulling the knife out, but it was not a matter of healing the wound. Reparations is healing the wound. It is compensation for the harms that have been caused by the plunging of the knife into the back in the first place. Obviously, we need to pull the knife out, but we also need to heal the wound. Both are essential. Reparations is pulling the knife out. But the final point I'd like to make in this context, in the context of this particular argument, and this is going to link back to the way in which we think about the origins of the Black-white wealth gap in the United States, is that the Civil War didn't actually have to take place for slavery to come to an end. In chapter 5 of our book, we talk at length about an array of proposals, frequently floated by Abraham Lincoln himself, for a scheme that we refer to as compensated emancipation. This is a scheme in which slaveholders would have been paid to free their human property. They would have been paid at least $200 to $300 per person, and in many proposals, a much higher sum. And I think in Frederick Douglass's proposal for compensated emancipation, the figure was about $200. That's significantly lower than the numbers that Abraham Lincoln himself floated. And Lincoln advanced these proposals before he became president of the United States. He continued to advance these proposals during the course of the Civil War, up into 1865, where the war soon was about to come to an end, to prevent further bloodshed from taking place. So I'd like to share a passage from our book with you about compensated emancipation as an alternative to the war, having certain types of consequences that, as an economist, we might have thought would have been cost effective. Let me see if I can find the particular passage without too much difficulty here. Yeah. So we say the following: the total financial cost of the war to the Union has been estimated at $6.1 billion. The Confederate financial cost has been estimated at $2.1 billion. Relative to these financial costs of the war, entirely apart from the human cost in mortality and morbidity, a bill of $3 billion would have provided $750 in compensation for each enslaved African had slaveholders been willing to part with the slave system. This solution would have been feasible for the federal government to meet, especially if the payments were staggered over a few years. The Civil War was fought over 1,336 days, from April 12, 1861 through May 13, 1865. If Southerners had emancipated 3,000 enslaved blacks each day of the hostilities at a cost of $750 each, the total expenditure would have capped at $3 billion. $3.1 billion less than the Union outlay, and $5 billion less than the total financial expenses for both sides of the conflict. The Southern states had a viable alternative to secession and war. They refused it. Now, the question I want to address with you is, why did the Southern states refuse the compensated emancipation option? In fact, they actually never offered a negotiated alternative to the amounts that were proposed under Lincoln's plan. There was one site in the United States where compensated emancipation actually was executed. This was during the midst of the Civil War, where compensated emancipation took place in the District of Columbia, the nation's capital. That's the only site. Lincoln tried ferociously to try to have the state of Delaware constitute the first state that would agree to compensated emancipation. And this was primarily because Delaware actually had a relatively low proportion of its population that was engaged in slaveholding. The Delaware legislature refused the proposal by a single vote. And so there was no individual state that was a slaveholding state that ever adopted compensated emancipation. So why didn't the Southerners choose compensated emancipation over the horrors of war? We can only speculate, and I think that it's going to be a very interesting project that Kirsten Mullen and I may take up, which is to try to examine documents and statements that are made by Southern spokespersons about this proposal. But the South never came to the negotiating table about this. It's estimated that at the onset of the Civil War, the total value of the enslaved property held by white Southerners was in the vicinity of $4 billion. And this is in 1860 dollars. This is not a present value estimate. Okay, so $4 billion as of 1860. If I'm thinking like an economist and trying to think about this as some sort of rational calculation that was being made, I presume that the Southerners felt that the loss of that property would exceed any type of compensation that they could get that would be substantial, because, not just because they were factoring in the immediate value of their property, but because they were committed to the extension of slavery into the Western territories, which they perceived to be a highly profitable opportunity or option. And so, to the extent that Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party consistently were opposing extension of slavery into the Western territories, the Southerners felt that they were going to be crippled in terms of their opportunities for gaining future profits and future wealth as a consequence. But in addition, it's important to note that slaveholding was not concentrated in a very small number of families throughout the South. Contrary to another assertion that's frequently made that only 1% of about white Southerners owned slaves, the data, the historical record from the slave statistics that were gathered by the Census Bureau indicate quite the opposite. At the low end, among states that joined the Confederacy, at least a quarter of individuals lived in families that were slave-owning families. At the upper end, we have fantastic numbers, 55 and 57% for Mississippi and South Carolina. In addition, more than half of all slave-holding families possessed 2 to 10 individuals. When we start to think about the 1% figure, the 1% figure applies to slaveholders who had 200 persons or more in human property. So slaveholding was pervasive, and so as a consequence, there was a wide number of Southerners who had a vested interest in preserving the system. But I think that the most critical factor here is, I believe that the traders who formed the Confederacy believed that they could win the war, that they could prevail, and that they also thought that they might prevail in a relatively short span of time. They did not anticipate the determination of Abraham Lincoln to prosecute the war to the extent that he was willing to do so. They anticipated, I believe, that within 2 years, the Union would agree that the Confederate States could separate themselves and form their own nation. And so as a consequence, I think they were surprised by Lincoln's determination to sustain hostilities to the extent that he was willing to do so for the purposes of preservation of the Union. Now, here's a critical dimension of the story, that when the war ended, there was a prime opportunity to actually create a society that was inclusive of Black Americans as full citizens. This didn't occur. But I want to talk about the climate that existed in the immediate aftermath of the war. We write the following in From Here to Equality, page 161, 162. When Whitelaw Reid traveled along the Atlantic coast and spoke with a cross-section of residents, including shopkeepers, Black artisans, farmers and planters, Freedmen's Bureau agents and officers, and freedmen in urban and rural areas, and toured several cotton plantations, he observed, it was manifest that if restoration of civil authority depended on Negro suffrage, it would be accepted. Schertz's report to Johnson concluded, when the news of Lee's and Joseph Johnston's surrenders burst upon the Southern country, the general consternation was extreme. The public mind was so despondent that if readmission at some future time, under whatever conditions had been promised, it would have been looked upon as a favor. Here, we say, was the ideal moment to push forward for the full array of Black rights. We go on to say, but when Johnson, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor after Lincoln's assassination, opened the door for North Carolina to reorganize its state government without making provisions for Blacks' political rights, and followed that with pardons and paroles for prominent wealthy insurgents, ex-Confederate leaders, generals and diplomats, Southerners understood the president was willing to concede to them more power than they had dared hope. Almost immediately after Johnson's proclamation was announced, white Southerners' resistance to Black voting and civil liberties began to harden. General John W. Sprague wrote of the mood he observed in Little Rock, Arkansas. Those who had returned from the rebel armies were the most quiet and orderly. It is not so now. Increasingly, Southern whites were observed treating freedmen with cruelty and callousness. So there was a prime opportunity immediately after the Civil War ended to actually establish Black citizenship on a full scale. This did not occur. There were two dimensions of the attempt to create full citizenship. One was the provision of the vote to Black men, but the second was the provision of allotments of 40 acres of land that were promised to the formerly enslaved as restitution for their years of bondage. Unfortunately, while the plan was initiated at the behest of General Sherman under Special Orders number 15, with the approval of Secretary of War Stanton, as well as the President Abraham Lincoln himself. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, his successor, Andrew Johnson, who Kirsten Mullen and I frequently refer to as the worst president the United States ever had, and that's saying something. Andrew Johnson reverses the attempt to establish full rights for Black Americans, and he reverses the land allocation plan. So approximately 400,000 acres of land had been allotted to 40,000 of the 4 million newly emancipated Blacks in the United States. Even that small allotment was restored to the former slaveholders, and the project was discontinued. Okay. So this, in our estimation, is the beginning or the origins of the Black-white wealth gap. It creates the foundation for the inability of Black families, grandparents, parents to transfer significant resources across the generations that are the primary source of wealth accumulation. In contrast, at the same time in which the newly emancipated were being denied the 40-acre land grants, the federal government was beginning to undertake a program that we now refer to as the Homestead Plan. And these homestead allocations involve the distribution of 160-acre land grants to white families in the western part of the United States that was being occupied through settler colonialism by the United States government. Approximately 1.5 million white families received access to land grants. These land grants were immense. They spanned approximately 287 million acres of land, encompassing both Texas and California, if you wanted to make an estimate of what the scope of the land grant looked like. Okay. These 287 million acres that were allotted have strong ramifications to the present day. The social scientist Trina Shanks Williams has estimated that approximately 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of those land grants. So folks frequently complain about handouts that are given to Black Americans. Well, there was no land handout given in the aftermath of the Civil War to Black Americans, but there was a significant land handout that was given to many, many white Americans, including recent immigrants to the United States. Okay. The land grant plan lasted for approximately 70 years from its onset in 1862 with the initial passage of the Homestead Acts. The wealth differential carries through by a number of other factors and events that take place subsequently that are linked to federal policy in the United States, either through active federal policy or the federal government looking the other way. During the Jim Crow period, there was a wave of massacres that took place, stretching both north and south in the United States, that involved the destruction of communities in which Black Americans had begun to acquire some level of property and some level of prosperity. The most dramatic example that many people are familiar with is probably the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre of 1921. But there were approximately 30 of these that took place just in the year 1919, which is frequently referred to as the Bloody Summer year. And that included massacres that took place in Washington, D.C., took place in Omaha, Nebraska, took place in Chicago, Illinois, and so on. But one of the effects of these massacres was, of course, significant loss in Black lives and destruction of Black property. But in many instances, it also involved the appropriation of Black property. And two examples that come to mind are Elaine, Arkansas, and Ocoee, Florida, where the appropriation of the property has been well documented. So that's two phases of events that lead to the Black-white wealth differential. The third phase concerns a set of policies in the 20th century that were focused on home ownership. And I think this is one of the reasons why people romance home ownership, is because of its significance and importance in the 20th century in building an American middle class. In the 20th century, the United States government adopts a series of policies that promote white home ownership to the detriment of black home ownership. This includes the provisions in the New Deal legislation for home mortgage subsidies. It includes the GI Bill, which was applied discriminatorily across the country. In the most extreme case, out of 3,200 returning veterans to the state of Mississippi, only 2 black veterans received the benefits of the home buying component of the GI Bill. And then, of course, there were other kinds of policies that were supported by federal policy, including redlining, that contributed to the differential in home ownership. So in the 19th century, the emphasis and focus is on land acquisition. In the 20th century, the emphasis and focus on for social mobility is on home ownership. And in both cases, there were sharp differentials in the degree of access that white and black families had to those types of provisions. Okay. So I'd like to conclude with the reinforcing the observation that I made at the very beginning about the black-white wealth gap being the most significant indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy in the United States. White supremacy manifests in federal policy. We will require dramatic federal policy to alter the consequences of what has been achieved by previous federal policies. And this dramatic federal policy must be a program of reparations.
Wow. Thank you so much for that incredible kind of, and I know it's only a small part of the work you've done. So thank you, Professor. So we have a lot of questions in the chat, and we'll try our best to get to a few in the next few moments. A reminder to everyone, if you haven't already, you can ask your questions using the Q&A feature. You can also up and down vote. So I'll start with one of the top questions right now. So Sarah says, assume that you don't have to convince me, that your case for reparations has been made and I'm on board. How would you recommend that it be implemented?
Let me highlight three dimensions. First, I would like to talk about who should be eligible to receive reparations. And from here to equality, we suggest that there are two criteria or conditions that need to be met. One is what we refer to as a lineage standard. The second is what we refer to as an identity standard. The lineage standard means that an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. The identity standard would mean that for at least 12 years before the adoption of a reparations plan or the adoption of a study commission for reparations, whichever comes first, an individual would have had to have self-identified on an official document as Black, Negro, Afro-American, or African-American. So the lineage standard is an ancestral condition. The identity standard is a matter of self-classification, but self-classification at a point in which there would be no significant material advantage to having claimed Blackness in the United States, okay? So that's the first thing. That's who's eligible, and that's how we would design the plan. The second thing is the amount of money that would be required to execute the plan, we argue in From Here to Equality that for the purposes of eliminating the racial wealth differential, it would require $10 to $12 trillion in funds. And then the third thing that I will mention, and there are other aspects of this plan that we discuss in detail in Chapter 13, but the third thing that I would highlight at this moment is how would the funds be distributed? And we emphasize that the primary purpose of the funds must be direct payments to eligible recipients. We think that this is entirely appropriate given the way in which reparations plans have been executed in the past. Whether it's the German government's payments to victims of the Holocaust, or in the US context, the payments that were made to Japanese Americans for their unjust incarceration during the course of World War II. We also think it's important that the payments be made directly to eligible recipients so that they will have the greatest degree of discretion over the funds use, rather than having the funds being controlled by a third party.
Thank you, thank you. And as a follow-up to that, I'll ask, in your imagination, do you see reparations as a purely physical action, or is there an emotional, mental, spiritual significance as well? And how do you see that significance manifesting for people on the ground, both white and Black?
So in From Here to Equality, we actually define reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. And I think the acknowledgement dimension, which is the recognition on the part of the culpable party that they have committed a deep harm, and they are now recognizing their responsibility to engage in restitution. That's this perhaps that comes closest to the spiritual component that that this question is asking about. But yes, acknowledgement, form of an apology that is accompanied by a commitment to engage in redress is critical from the standpoint of our view of a reparations plan. Now, the second step is, of course, redress, or the provision of restitution. And we've emphasized in our book, like other reparations plans that we're familiar with, the important component of this is the provision of direct payments to eligible recipients. And then the third dimension of this is closure, which also may have a spiritual dimension as well. Closure is the mutual agreement on the part of the culpable party and the victimized community that the debt has been paid, that the account has been settled. And what this would mean is not that we forget about the atrocities, but that the victimized community would make no further claims on the culpable party for restitution unless atrocities were renewed or a new type of atrocity took place.
Thank you, thank you. So I have a question from Kevin. So we'll probably do maybe two more. So stipulated that the wealth gap has its roots in slavery. Are Black people more entitled to reparations than other repressed groups such as Native Americans, Chinese laborers, Jewish people, Irish people, queer folks?
You know, this is a question that I find really has a spirit of obstruction to it. I don't treat this as a question that's raised in good faith. And the reason I don't is because when reparations were being considered for the victims of the Holocaust, no one asked whether or not other groups should also be receiving reparations, or whether other groups' reparations claims might take priority. Similarly, no one asked this when the Japanese American restitution case was brought forward. And to be frank, I don't think anyone should have asked that. It's interesting that this question is consistently asked when we are concerned about reparations for Black Americans. And I think that folks who raise this question need to think about why they do that. Okay, so that's my first comment. My second comment is that I certainly acknowledge that there's any number of communities that might well have a valid claim for reparations on the United States government. I encourage them to bring forth that claim. I encourage researchers or scholars who might support those claims to write their own book. It's not the book that we wrote. Our book is focused specifically on the claim that's associated with the injustices that have been inflicted on Black American descendants of US slavery. If there are other communities that want to come forward with their claims, fine. Those claims, however, are not the same claim as this one. And I would particularly like to separate the claim that is associated with the Native American community from the claim that's associated with Black American descendants of US slavery. The Native American claim, by my understanding, is primarily a claim for sovereignty, while the Black American claim is primarily a claim for the material conditions for full citizenship. And they're not the same, and they shouldn't be merged or collapsed onto one another.
Thank you so much. I think because of time, we'll end the Q&A there. But I really appreciate just the work that you're doing, the advocacy, and the study that you're doing, Professor. And so on behalf of the Alumni Association, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in to this forum, especially to the alumni and all the question askers. Sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but thank you for being here. If you have any ideas for topics or speakers in this series or any other feedback, please reach out to alumnilearn@mit.edu. We're going to be sure to forward all the questions asked in the Q&A to Professor Daugherty, and staff are going to keep the chat open for networking and discussion purposes for another 15 minutes. A reminder that this broadcast will be available on the MIT Association YouTube channel within a week of today. And so just thank you so much to everyone for joining us for the MIT Forum for Equity. Professor Dyer, I'll let you have a couple minutes if you want any last words, and then we'll close.
No, I just am grateful for having had the opportunity to talk to folks, and especially proud to have had the opportunity to be the speaker who followed the event that you had with Craig Stephen Wilder and his students. I think he's a phenomenal scholar, and we make extensive use of some of his work on the history of colleges and universities and slavery in our book. So thank you very much for having me.
Definitely. Thank you so much to everyone. You all have a good afternoon.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.